welcome home. We are LifeSpring Church Online, where we exist to live for God, love all people, and lead others to do the same by being a family where you can belong before you believe. I sure am glad that you've joined us today, and I especially want to welcome you if it's your first time ever with us. And if that's you, I just want to let you know it's okay to have questions. It's okay to have doubts. It's okay to not even be sure what you believe about Jesus, or even if you believe in Jesus, because in this family, it's okay to have questions. It's okay to have concerns. It's okay to have doubts and to express those doubts. We are a family where you can belong with us even before you believe like us. If at any point today you're like, man, I would love to connect, you can do so immediately by jumping into the live conversation through our chat. But if you would think that you would rather just kind of stay anonymous and just kind of observe things by just watching the message without engaging in the chat, that is completely okay too. We would love for you to join us. And if at any point today you feel like you need someone to pray with you or pray for you, or you just need someone to talk to, then on Church Online you can simply click the live prayer button at the bottom of our screen. And if you're streaming this on another platform, just drop us an email to hello@lifespringnc.com. Once again, we are so glad you're here today. And now, let's join today's message. If you asked me to describe the year 2020 in one word, I could not do it. I would actually have to pick two words. The first one would be unsettling. I think all of us would probably agree that 2020 is certainly one of the most unsettling years in our nation's history. And for many of us, it's the most unsettling year in our entire lives. From the start of a pandemic, which has affected practically everybody, to many people losing lives in that, many people losing jobs because of government shutting down business during that. And that was just the first part of the year that has continued through today. You add to that the racial unrest that has risen to the surface and has been really had a lot of attention drawn to it through the tragedies with George Floyd and now Jacob Blake, and certainly our hearts go out to our African American brothers and sisters. And then you add the violence and the riots that have happened in the wake of that in many instances. Our country right now is extremely, extremely unsettled. The second thing that I would use to describe 2020 in America is divided. We live in perhaps the most polarized, most divisive time in our history, and it seems like on every single issue, from the coronavirus to racial unrest to everything in between, it seems like everybody feels the need to pick a side, to stake a claim out, and then to argue and demonize the other side. And then to top it all off, you bring all that together, and then you add a presidential election, and we have the components for an absolutely toxic year. Now, all that is extremely negative, but there's a beautiful opportunity in that for the church. I believe that there's never been a more crucial time for Christians to be the light in the darkness that our world desperately needs. That's why on September 13th, we're starting a brand new series called A More Perfect Union. And we're going to spend 4 weeks talking about how, as Christians, we enter this unsettled, divisive, polarized season, and we live in it as people who really are life-giving, as people who really do shine as lights in the darkness, and as people who bring hope into a world that feels hopeless. So, September 13th, be here or tune in. We're going to talk about that. And I think, honestly, it gives us a chance to really make a significant impact in the lives of people around us. Today, we're finishing off a series called Unstoppable. And we've been talking the last few weeks about what the church is actually supposed to be. We've talked about how the church is not a meeting, the church is a movement. And over the last few weeks, we've talked about how we step into the church being a movement. And here's what we all know. We all know that all of us like to move. None of us like the feeling of being stuck and going nowhere. And perhaps there's no more frustrating moment than when you're stuck and going nowhere and it's kind of your fault. For example, when you get a vehicle of any kind stuck in mud. In fact, if you've done that, I would really love to know about it. It'll make me feel better. You can just drop it in the chat. I've gotten multiple vehicles stuck in the mud. I have got a minivan stuck in the mud. That's a totally different story for another time. I've also got my lawnmower stuck multiple times in the mud. You might say, if you keep doing this, why is that? Because I make a very unwise decision. I go a direction that is the wrong direction. I end up in a place that's the wrong place. And then when I do that, I feel on my lawnmower specifically the very unsettling feeling of my butt dropping as the back wheels start digging a hole in my backyard. And then I make the unwise decision to press the gas harder. It doesn't work. The tires just spin more, I'm stuck, then I have to get out, and because I'm in an area of my yard that's muddy, I sink like that far down, I have to push things, I hurt my back, it's frustrating, and it just ends up being a really, really unpleasant experience because I'm stuck. And it's frustrating because I shouldn't have even been there to start with because I went the wrong direction. Now, hopefully you can relate to that. Hopefully you have sympathy for me in that. And hopefully you don't judge me because chances are you've been there too. But there's a picture that situation points us to. And it's a picture of our lives and what can often happen for us corporately as a church. What happens? We end up going the wrong direction. We end up doing things we shouldn't do. And as a result, individually or corporately, we end up spinning our wheels and making absolutely no progress because we've gone the wrong direction. And that begs the question, well, what would you define as the wrong direction? And I would say the wrong direction would very simply be this: a life that is focused completely on ourselves. An inward-focused life that is all about individually, what can I get for me? What's in it for me? What is best for me? An inward focus on a corporate level, on a church level, would have many times the very same questions. What's best for us? What makes us most comfortable? What are our preferences? What makes us happy? And the problem with that is that a life that is focused on me ultimately will not fulfill me. A church that is only focused on itself and what happens within its four walls or even within just its community will often stall out because the focus is very inward. And when the focus is inward, guess what you stop doing? You stop reaching out. You stop stepping out of your comfort zone like we talked last week. And as that happens, we become stuck. We start spinning our wheels and we don't go anywhere. And so if we're going to see movement happen in our lives as individuals and movement happen for us as a church to become the unstoppable movement that God calls us to, we have to move away from an inward focus and back towards an outward focus, which means, in a lot of ways, we redefine our purpose. And we understand that our purpose is not living a life that is all about myself, not living a life corporately that is all about our preferences, but living a life that grabs onto a purpose that outlives us. That's actually what creates movement. Not living so much for the right here, right now, but grabbing onto something and living for something that outlives us. A guy named Paul knew this. In fact, at the very end of Paul's life, when he knows he's about to be executed for his faith, Paul knows and understands that his purpose is not just about right here, right now. His purpose, in order for him to have this movement in his life, is to live for something that outlives himself. Here's how he describes this to his protege Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, starting in verse 1. He says this: "You then, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus, and the things you have heard from me say in the presence of many witnesses." Watch this. "Entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others." Now, you may wonder, how does that have anything to do with a purpose that outlives you? So let me back up and explain it. Somebody at some point in Paul's life helped point him to Jesus. Somebody at some point in Paul's life helped Paul grow as a follower of Jesus. And then Paul takes that and he helps other people grow. In fact, 3 of the people that he specifically invested his life in were Timothy, Titus, and a guy named Philemon. And he's intentionally talking to Timothy right here. And what he tells Timothy is this: hey, what I want you to do is take what I've taught you, and I want you to teach it to other people who in turn will teach other people. So get what happens here. Somebody told Paul the gospel. Paul teaches Timothy the gospel. Paul understands his purpose does not stop with teaching Timothy, but teaching Timothy to teach others who will teach others. And Paul understands, man, that creates movement because that's a purpose that outlives me and in fact actually has eternal implications, which is ultimately why this is a big deal, because here's reality. Every single person will spend eternity in one of two places: either heaven in the presence of God or hell separated with God forever. So all of us will end up in an eternal destination. The single greatest thing then that you and I can be a part of is leading people to the right eternal destination. The single greatest thing you and I can be a part of is helping people step into a relationship with Christ so that they'll spend eternity with God, but doing more than just that, also helping them to also reach other people with the gospel, who will in turn reach other people with the gospel. So when you start looking at that and how that moves down from one generation to the next generation, if you embrace the fact that you as a follower of Jesus are called to reach other people with the gospel and help the people you reach other people with the gospel, not only do you have a purpose that outlives you like Paul had, you have a purpose that literally makes a difference in eternity. That's a big deal. All of us, I think, would say, man, I want to live for something that outlives me. But this goes beyond just me. This dynamic, which you could use the word multiplication, one person reaches another person, that's actually what creates movement in our own lives, because it keeps us outward focused, it keeps us stepping out of our comfort zone, but it also is the thing that is the catalyst that launches the church into being an unstoppable movement. You could put it this way: multiplication makes us a movement. An unstoppable church is not just about adding people. An unstoppable church is about multiplying followers of Jesus. The way we put it at LifeSpring is this: we live for God, we love all people, and we lead others to do the same. What do? Well, we lead others to live for God, love all people, and lead others to do the same. They also lead others to live for God, love all people, and lead others to do the same. Multiplication happens here, and as we multiply, that's what creates movement, and it has an exponential effect. You might say, what do you mean? Well, think about how we got to the population we have in the world today. From just 8 people on Noah's Ark. What happened? Multiplication happened. If you're not sure exactly what that means, you can email Mark at lifespringnc.com. He would love to explain that to you. There's an exponential effect of multiplication. This is also how the church went from a group of just 12 people to completely overtaking the Roman Empire in just about 300 years. When multiplication is the focus, when it's not just about me, when it's not just about my preferences in my life, when it's not just about, as Christians, my walk with Jesus, but when it becomes about reaching other people, and not just reaching them, but helping them teach others to follow Jesus, who in turn teach others how to reach and teach others, that's what creates an unstoppable movement. And here's the thing, I know the pushback might be this: well, Dylan, Paul is like a professional Christian. Paul's like super Christian. I mean, he started churches, he was a missionary. Like, I'm not Paul. But here's what we have to understand. This mission is not just for super Christians. This mission is not just for pastors and missionaries and super spiritual people. This is the mission of every single follower of Jesus. And particularly in our nation, guys, there has never been a greater need for this to happen in America than right now. In fact, I'm going to share some numbers with you that I hope you find unsettling. Over the last 5 years, the number of people in America that identify themselves as followers of Jesus has dropped from 75% to 65%. 10% drop in 5 years. The church in America is losing ground. Why? Part of it, I believe, is because we tend to become inward focused. We tend to focus on our preferences and our safety and our comfort. And we've moved away from multiplying followers of Jesus. But man, what if we got back to that? In fact, what if just half of that 65% decided, okay, over the course of my life, I want to reach 3 people that are far from God and help them follow Jesus? That would be 33% of Americans. So do the math here. If 33% of Americans are Christians and they each commit to reaching 3 people, you know what happens? Over the course of a generation, if they're each reaching like another third of America and another third of America, you see what happens in a generation? Our country could be completely reached. You might say, Dylan, that's a pipe dream. Hey, you know what I get tired of? I get tired of Christians that are so focused on how bad it's going to get that we use it as an excuse to not try to reach people in the present. My gosh, do we think that somehow the gospel has lost its power? Do we think that somehow God doesn't want to add more and more people to His kingdom? Do we somehow think that the Holy Spirit could not once again bring an awakening to our nation? I tell you what, how it won't happen. It won't happen as long as we stay in our walls and do nothing. But I believe if we start to think about, hey, how can I reach somebody else? And how can I teach them to reach somebody else who will teach them to reach somebody else? Man, I think we could see a move of God in our nation that will change our nation. It will not happen by us sitting in our comfort zone. It will happen to us returning to multiplication. Multiplication is what makes us a movement. So, here's the question. How do we get to that? How do we move towards that sort of thinking? And I believe there are 4 mindset shifts that have to happen. And by the way, if you're not a Christian, you're tuning in, I'm incredibly excited you're here. I'm glad you're here. I'm thankful for your presence. I believe these 4 mindset shifts will not just move us corporately as a church towards multiplication. I believe these 4 mindsets will dramatically impact and change your life if you're willing to grab onto them. So here's the first one. We have to be willing to suffer. You might say, that is not the best sales pitch. And I get it. It kind of reminds me of kind of what Grace and I went through before we had our son. Typically, we'd have conversations like this. Hey, when are y'all going to have kids? Which, by the way, just don't ask married people that, especially if they don't have kids. It just gets so incredibly annoying. It really, really does. And then it gets really annoying after that you have one kid. You're like, when are you going to give them a brother and sister? It's like, my gosh, we just got the first one out. Can we think about that it's just annoying. So just if that's you, just in the name of Jesus, stop it. But we'd have that happen, and then we'd be like, we're thinking about it and praying about it. And then typically the wife in that situation goes on to tell you, Grace, well, let me tell you about how awful my pregnancy was. I didn't sleep for 9 months, and I haven't slept in the 9 months afterwards. I felt sick all the time. I gained 500 pounds and felt like a whale. My feet were swollen. I felt awful, and delivery was just a nightmare. And then it's like, and you want me to go through that? It's like that doesn't feel like the best sales pitch. Like you should be talking about how awesome your child is and how cute they are and adorable and loving and how being a mom is the best thing. Leading with suffering is not the best sales pitch. So I get it. When the idea of, hey, in order for us to create movement, in order for us to move to multiplication, in order for you to see change in your life, you have to be willing to suffer. Doesn't sound like the best sales pitch. But it's exactly what Paul leads with. In fact, check out verse 3. Paul says this, join with me in suffering like a good soldier of Christ Jesus. Doesn't seem like the best sales pitch. It seems like Paul might need to go back and read How to Win Friends and Influence People, because it seems like he's leading with the bad news. But the question is, why is he doing this? Because here's what Paul knows. Paul knows that if we as individuals and we corporately as a church are to step into God's plan for us, which is multiplying disciples, Paul knows that that is moving into enemy territory. Satan does not want us to multiply disciples. Satan does not want us to reach people. So when we move towards that, guess what? We're stepping into a spiritual battle. We're stepping into a spiritual war. We're stepping into spiritual conflict. That's why he refers to Timothy and himself as a soldier of Christ Jesus. And in conflict and war, there's going to be pain. There's going to be suffering. There's going to be wounds. There's going to be loss. Of course, the question then is, well, why in the world would I do that? Because of the payoff. Because Paul realizes, hey, when you step into multiplication, when you start reaching people and leading them to reach others, you know what happens? It impacts eternity. And when we all are standing in front of God's presence in eternity with the people we helped lead to Jesus, and they're there as well as a result of God working through us, you know what? It will make what we went through on earth seem like absolutely nothing. We go through the suffering because the payoff is worth it. And that's not really an earth-shattering idea. You know this. This is why, like, if you're into working out, this is why you work out. It's not because you enjoy it. Anybody that's like, man, I really have fun working out, you're probably doing it wrong. Well, like, I do not enjoy running and like the feeling of my legs feeling like 100 pounds. I do not enjoy lifting weights and feeling the burn when I'm on my last rep. It's just not that much fun. But why do I do it? Because of the payoff. Nobody, if they're being honest, really enjoys eating kale. But you do it anyway. Why? Because of the payoff. What is the payoff? When we embrace multiplication, that leads us to be willing to suffer. Eternal impact. A purpose that outlives us. And a purpose that one day will completely pay off when we're standing in eternity with Jesus, surrounded by the people we helped lead to Him. Will stepping into our purpose be painful? Absolutely. But the payoff will be worth it. We have to be willing to suffer. The second thing is this. We have to be willing to focus. Here's one thing I've learned as a new dad. Multitasking with an infant is impossible. Like, you just can't do it. Like, early on, when Grace and I were trying to figure out our work rhythms and how to take care of Kason, I would try to do things like write a message or send emails while kind of trying to keep an eye on Kason and keep him entertained. It just didn't work. Like, as a result, I did neither thing well, and I just would get frustrated. Why? Because I didn't focus. So, like, now, when it's my time to watch Kason, I just turn my computer off because I'm like, I ain't going to get anything else done. I'm just going to focus on him. If you're going to do something well, you have to be able to focus, which is why Paul says this to Timothy next in verse 4. He says, no one serving as a soldier gets entangled in civilian affairs, but rather tries to please his commanding officer. A soldier, Paul writes, has one single focus: doing what his commanding officer says, pleasing his commanding officer. So, as followers of Jesus, what does our focus have to be? Our focus has to be the mission that God has called us to. What has God called us to? Multiply disciples. You might say, but Dylan, I'm so busy. And hey, I get that. So I want to teach you a slight shift that will not necessarily mean you stop doing something, but it will mean you refocus your attention. Making disciples does not necessarily mean that you sell everything you have, quit your job, and become a full-time missionary, or go to seminary and try to get into ministry. It doesn't necessarily mean that. What it simply means is this. Look at your relationships. Look at your career. Look at your hobbies. Look at where you live, where you work, where you play, and then ask one very simple question. How can I leverage the places God has placed me in and the relationships I have to multiply disciples? What are the opportunities in the places God already has me to reach people that don't know Jesus, teach them how to follow them, and teach them to lead others to do the same? It's not that you necessarily stop doing what you're doing. It's you redirect your focus. You redirect your attention. And you begin asking, hey, why has God put me where I am? And how might God want me to leverage that to reach other people through it? We refocus. And when we refocus, hey, I believe that's where we see opportunities open up that we did not see before. And we step into our purpose of multiplying disciples. The third thing is this: we have to live right. We have to live right. If we are going to effectively reach people with the good news of Jesus, we cannot afford to do anything that causes other people to doubt our integrity. So, what I'm about to say is probably going to make everybody on all sides mad at something. So I just want to prepare you for that. And I'm not trying to make you mad because I enjoy making you mad. I don't. But there's a couple of dynamics that have to be addressed in the church that I think if we don't address them, I think it undercuts our effectiveness. So I'm going to hit everybody from every angle, and then you can all be mad at me, and you can email David at lifespringnc.com with your complaints. It'll be great. Okay, so if we're not careful, our lives and our actions can send messages that undercut our effectiveness. So let's hit it from a political angle first. On 4th of July weekend, my wife and I were in Wilmington. We're on the boardwalk, and we walked behind a guy who had this shirt. I'll read the shirt. And by the way, if you get mad, I'm going to hit the other side in a second, so it'll be okay. The shirt said this: I stand for the anthem. I pray to Jesus. I say Merry Christmas. If this offends you, then leave. But let me just ask you this. How does that attitude draw anybody who maybe has a more liberal political bent to Jesus? It kind of makes you sound like a jerk. It kind of makes you sound like you're flipping a big middle finger to them, to be honest. If you turn around and try to invite that person to church and tell them about the gospel, do you think they want to listen? Probably not. You're sacrificing potential effectiveness for Jesus for the sake of making a political point. That's the conservative side. Now let me hit the liberal side. Earlier this past week, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, made a statement that Republicans were domestic enemies. It's not helpful. I made a comment on Facebook. It's not helpful. I had somebody who claims to be a Christian respond back, well, I don't necessarily disagree with her. And it's like, okay, has not Jesus called you to reach people on the political right who don't know God? Well, if you're calling them domestic enemies, what makes you think they want to listen to you? You're literally alienating them with your words. You're undercutting your effectiveness for the gospel for the sake of making a political point. That's not just unwise as a Christian, it's wicked. And I believe one of the quickest ways we play for Team Satan is when we exalt the importance of an election, which, by the way, we'll do this whole dance again in 4 years, over the importance of reaching souls for eternity. That's the political angle. Let's talk about the racial angle. If you're white and you're utterly dismissive to the pain and suffering that your black brothers and sisters are going through, what makes you think they want to listen to you when you invite them to follow Jesus? They won't. It'll seem kind of hypocritical because you just don't want to listen to their pain, but you want to tell them about Jesus. There's a disconnect there. On the other hand, for my black brothers and sisters, if you want to tell white people about Jesus, but you kind of don't object to much of the violence that has happened in the wake of some of these tragedies that have happened, then it makes your white brothers and sisters kind of distrust you. Here's the point I'm trying to make, guys. When we kind of pick and choose what we get upset about or don't get upset about, it moves us on the fast track to hypocrisy, and people just don't want to listen to us because they're like, well, you're just picking one side or the other. You're not actually serious. You're not actually wanting to reach me for Jesus. You just want to get me in your particular camp, whatever that camp happens to be. If we're Christians, we can't conveniently ignore somebody's pain or conveniently ignore somebody's wrong actions just because it's inconvenient for our particular point of view. If we're going to be Christians and be effective in reaching the gospel, then we must live with the utmost integrity in every single area of our lives. That's why Paul says this in verse 5. He says, similarly, anyone who competes as an athlete does not receive the victor's crown except by competing according to the rules. What are the rules? What Jesus said. And Jesus does not give us permission to ignore any of His rules. Period. Regardless of what side we're on, regardless of what viewpoint we have, every single one of us is called to unyieldingly, as followers of Jesus, live for God, do everything God says to His glory. Love all people, regardless of whether you agree with them, disagree with them, whatever. If we do that, we can lead others to do the same. If we don't do that, we step outside of bounds, we step away from the rules, and we become stuck. We have to live in integrity. Our lives have to support the message we're sending. We cannot afford to live lives that undercut the message that we send. Because at the end of the day, what is more important? The points we want to make, or reaching people with the gospel and changing their eternities? Let's not sacrifice our ability to make an eternal impact for the sake of a momentary point. And the last mindset shift is this. We have to work hard for a long time. We have to work hard for a long time. This is not going to be an easy process. It will not happen overnight. Which I believe is why Paul says this in verse 6. He says the hard-working farmer should be the first to receive a share of the crops. Multiplication, it takes hard work. It takes time. And you don't see a crop overnight. You don't see things change overnight. It takes persistence. It takes persistence through pain. It takes perseverance when it seems like nothing is going right. And there will absolutely be seasons, guys, if we step into this, where it's like, I don't see any options. I'm trying, but it's not working. Or I'm trying and it seems like things are moving in the opposite direction. What do we do in that? We remember the farmer who tills up the ground, who removes the weeds, who plants seeds, who waters, who removes more weeds, and waits patiently day after day after day and continues to tend to his crop. And eventually, guess what? Harvest time. It doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen over time. Which I believe is why Paul encourages with this in Galatians 6, verse 9. This has been such an incredible verse to me in this season. He says this, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. If we're willing to suffer and push through the suffering, if we're willing to live right and never sacrifice our integrity just for the sake of making a point, if we're willing to work hard for a long time and persist, then Paul says eventually we'll reap a harvest. Eventually, in God's time, we'll see the results. That's what we're shooting for. In fact, I remember a guy saying this. I forget who it was that said this. But what they said was this. We often overestimate what God will do in the short run. But we also often underestimate what God will do through a lifetime of faithfulness. this mission, multiplication, is not something we're just called to pursue in the moment. It's something we're called to pursue the rest of our lives. There will be seasons where it feels like we're hitting it out of the park. There will be seasons where it feels like we're not gaining ground. There will be seasons where it feels like we're moving backwards. But if we persist for a long time, then we'll reap a harvest if we don't give up. And we'll see the results, not just in eternity, but I believe we'll see the results in this life, in our community, right now. Let's multiply disciples. Let's commit to living for God, loving all people, and leading others to do the same so they can lead others to live for God and love all people and lead others to do the same. And I believe if we commit to that, I believe, without a doubt, that we will once again become an unstoppable movement. So, Father, my prayer for us today is that you will move us out of our comfort zone and lead us to focus on the mission you've called us to as a church. As you're praying this morning, this starts with just simply one step, identifying one person in your life who does not yet know Jesus and making it a point to pursue them, to invest in them, to invite them to church, to have conversations with them. In fact, the question I would ask this morning is, who's that one person in your life? Who's that one person in your life? And most of us know. And in fact, if you know, then just type in the chat, I will commit. As you commit to reaching that one person, it starts with one person. God, I'm convinced this puts somebody in your life to reach. And Father, I pray for those that will commit and are committing, that they will reach the people you've put them around. And Lord, even that within the next year, we would see that person, their one person they're going to invest in, respond to the gospel and have their life changed by you. As you continue praying this morning, the very first step towards multiplying disciples of Jesus is becoming a disciple of Jesus yourself. It's becoming a follower of Jesus. Notice I didn't say it's believing things about Jesus, because there are a lot of people who believe things about Jesus who are not actually disciples of Jesus. Becoming a Christian is not just about an intellectual belief that, yeah, Jesus died for my sins and He rose from the dead and He's God. It's also about committing to give Him control of your life. It's also about following Him wherever He tells you to go, doing whatever He tells you to go. Head knowledge alone is not salvation. Submitting yourself to the Lordship of Christ is what has to come with that. And perhaps that's you today. Perhaps you recognize as you're sitting there watching, you know what? Maybe I believe things about Jesus, but I'm certainly not living for Jesus. I'm certainly not giving my life to Him. I'm certainly not honoring Him in my day-to-day life. And perhaps you realize right now that even though maybe you've believed things about Jesus, you've never actually become a Christian. You've never actually become a follower of Jesus. And if that's you this morning, I want to invite you to surrender your life to Jesus, to actually step into His family, to actually give Him control of your life and let Him redefine your purpose as He makes you a part of His mission. And make no mistake, this is a decision with eternal implications, because you will spend eternity in either heaven or hell based on what you decide towards Jesus. Will you give your life to Him today? If that's you, simply say from your heart, Lord Jesus, I need you. I don't just believe in you, but I surrender to your Lordship. I commit to follow you wherever you tell me to go and to do whatever you tell me to do. Jesus, my life is not my own. It now belongs to you. And I'm all yours, and I'm all in. Jesus, thank you for saving me. In your name, amen. If you prayed that prayer, we celebrate that. We rejoice with that. That is exactly why we do what we do. And we'd love for you to click the button right below us on Church Online. Just respond yes in the chat on YouTube or Facebook. We thank you for taking that step. We celebrate that with you. It is the single most important thing you can do, and we would love to help you start taking steps in your new journey as a member of God's family. Guys, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, September 13th, we'll start a brand new series called A More Perfect Union, and we'll also be moving to 2 gatherings that day, 9:30 a.m. and 11 a.m. Be here. Next weekend, Pastor Mark is doing a very special one-off called Are There Many Ways to God? It's a great opportunity to invite people who don't know Jesus to check us out, whether online or in person that day. I love y'all guys. Thank y'all so much for being with us. We'll see y'all soon.
Thank you so much for joining us today with Life Spring Church Online. I'm Mark. I'm one of the pastors here at Life Spring, and I'm super thrilled that you joined us today. If you found today's message helpful, by the way, take a minute, share it with a friend, invite someone to join you next week to come back as we continue to offer hope week after week with Life Spring Church Online. Specifically, if you're new, I want to give you a big shout out and say thank you so much for joining us. We believe that God has truly made you unique, and God has made you to be a difference maker. And one of our goals at Life Spring Church is to help you step into that reality. What does it look like for you to become the difference maker that God has wired you to be? So if there's any way that we can help you, we would love to do so. By the way, if you're not following us on Facebook, before you get off your phone or tablet today or your laptop, take a minute, follow us on Facebook. We would love to connect with you that way and let you stay in touch with what's going on through Life Spring Church and how God's working in our community. At Life Spring, we say this all the time, but we truly believe it, that God has called us to make a difference in our community. And we believe that the way that will happen is as we live for God, as we love all people, and as we lead others to do the same. And we gather together every week so that we can be sent back out. So at this time, Life Spring Church, you are